This is the second part of the Week 6 lecture where we look at the Dolgoff schema for examining a social welfare policy or program. So when you undertake your projects, you'll want to cover these basic structural components to start out with. You'll want to talk about the goals of the program. You'll want to talk about the type of the benefit that's being offered. You'll want to talk about the eligibility structure. You'll want to talk about how the program is financed. And then finally, of course, you'll want to talk about the level of administration. So these 5 dimensions are the core dimensions of your chosen policy or program, and I'd like you to cover those at minimum. And I'd like you to consider some other basic characteristics of your program. So this distinction between residualist thinking and institutionalist thinking, I'll talk about all of this as we go along, but whether your program reflects one philosophy or the other. I'd also like you to consider selective versus universal principles, and whether your program reflects one or both of those principles. And then we make a distinction between public and private entities or organizations, and so you'll want to talk about that in your paper as well. But first, in terms of the goals, the needs and goals of the program, so your chosen policy or program is going to be intended to address some particular need, societal need, or maybe some problem or issue in our society. There may be a larger focus, but in terms of specific needs that programs are designed to address, so your program may be an economic security program or income support program. That may be the need that's being addressed by your program. It may have to do with healthcare. It may have to do with childcare. So there are different needs that social welfare programs are designed to address. Your program may be designed to address a specific problem or issue in our society. There's no such shortage of programs or policies in our society. So it may be designed to address teen pregnancy, of homelessness, hunger, malnutrition, what have you. But that may be the goal, or there may be a broader goal in mind. So I'm thinking of the Head Start program, where it's not necessarily just about education. We think about, I think most people think about the education component, but Head Start is really designed with lots of different goals in mind. Education, certainly one. Socialization, getting kids ready, sort of on a comprehensive level for formal schooling. So these are the different things, the different goals that you'll want to talk about, the different aspects of your program that you want to talk about in this section. One caveat here is that the goals of your program may be either stated or unstated. So the trick here is to make sure you're also reading between the lines. And so there may be explicit stated goals, and that'll be easy for us. But we'll want to identify those unstated objectives as well. So the example that I give here is with respect to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. So clearly, the stated objective here is for the program to address nutrition assistance, provide nutrition assistance, to make sure that people are able to purchase a minimally adequate diet. But there are also unstated objectives here. If you look at the program design, so your electronic debit card that you use, in the case of Illinois, we use the Link Card. It's called the Link Card program. But you can't use the Link Card to purchase things like alcohol or tobacco-related products, or even pet food for that matter. So there's this unstated objective, I think, that the government is intending to control the purchase of certain products to the exclusion of others. So there's that implicit objective often with various programs. You'll want to talk about the type of benefits. So what the basic question here is, what does the program produce? Different programs produce different benefits or services. So in the case of unemployment insurance, for example, certainly the type of benefit there is going to be cash income. Cash income for a temporary amount of time for those who've lost employment. In the case of a family social service agency, the form or the type of benefit that's offered might be individual or group counseling, or maybe even family counseling or support groups. In the case of a housing project or the housing voucher program, it might be housing itself offered at a low cost to recipients. It might be housing vouchers that are used in turn to purchase housing in the private market. So different types of benefits that can be offered under different programs. You want to say something about the type of benefit, but you'll also want to say something about the level of benefit that's being offered as well. So in terms of the type of benefit, you want to speak to whether the benefits are offered in cash or in kind. And so this basic differentiation here is just, it's pretty self-explanatory. I think you have cash benefits. You have some programs or services, programs or policies that offer cash assistance. But then you have some programs or policies that offer things like housing or things like housing vouchers. It's not necessarily cash income. You may have an agency that's offering counseling. That's not cash. That's in-kind. That services offered in kind. So the basic distinction is between cash and services often. You may have sort of a hybrid program. So the SNAP program is offering a debit card. That's going to be considered near cash. So we make this distinction in the form of the benefit. You'll want to say something about the level of benefit. Some programs, you'll want to ask questions like, does the cash income that the program provides, is it sufficient for the family to maintain a minimal standard of living, for example? That might be one question that you ask. In the case of a program that offers counseling, you may want to ask, well, is the counseling that's being offered, does it help the family function in everyday society? For example, that might be a question that you might want to ask. Eligibility structure, you'll want to discuss this in some level of detail, in a degree of detail actually. But you'll want to think about what sort of risks are covered. What is the program designed to? What sort of risks is the program designed to address? So in the case of the SNAP program, the basic eligibility criteria, you need to meet federal poverty guidelines. So you must meet those poverty guidelines that we've established through the poverty thresholds. In the case of community mental health services that are being offered, you must reside within a particular district to receive services. Those are the basic eligibility criteria. In the case of the Medicare program, we have various pathways into Medicare eligibility. You can qualify on the basis of age, on the basis of receipt of disability insurance benefits for a certain number of years, or maybe through end-stage renal disease or kidney failure. In the case of Social Security, you have eligibility based on covered employment if you've been employed for a certain amount of time. So all these programs have different eligibility pathways. Daycare, basic child care program may require the child to be of a certain age. So these two sections, the benefit structure, the eligibility structure, you must do a bang-up job on these two sections. These are arguably the most important sections in your paper. And then the next structural component, you want to talk about financing, how your program is funded, where the revenues for your program come from, how those revenues or that funding gets channeled. In other words, Dolgoff mentions different funding schemes or mechanisms. He talks about general revenue funding, dedicated or earmarked funding. He talks about employer-employee taxes, and also payments by recipients themselves and then combinations. In terms of general revenue funding, we've talked about this before, but this is essentially our income taxes paid, right? Our federal income taxes, our state income taxes, our local income taxes. That revenue that's being used to operate social welfare programs, that's general revenue funding. This is a concept that may apply to private entities as well. So you may have an agency like the Alzheimer's Association that collects donations for maybe general local chapter operations. That's an example of general revenue funding applied to a private entity. The next type of funding mechanism that Dolgoff discusses is dedicated or earmarked financing, and we've come across this term before. So you may have some tax or some revenue scheme that's being directed for a very specific purpose. So in the case of Social Security, at the government level, you have a program like Social Security that collects revenues, and those revenues, they pay benefits for current recipients, but also they get directed towards the trust funds. And so we have an example of funds being directed for specific purposes. This may apply in the case of a private entity as well. So once again, in the case of the Alzheimer's Association, they may be collecting donations not just for general chapter purposes, but they may be directing their funds towards research purposes. In that case, that's going to be an example of a dedicated or earmarked funding. You may have employer-employee taxes that are being used to finance the program. So this is pretty straightforward. This is a tax that's going to be assessed on both the worker and the business that employs the worker. You may want to talk about the type of tax that's being assessed. So is it a progressive tax, is it a regressive tax, or is it a proportional or flat tax that's being assessed? And then finally, you have some agencies that assess some sort of fees, user fees on the recipients themselves. So we have payments by the recipients is how Dolgoff characterizes it. This is often done on a sliding scale basis in the case of nonprofit entities. So what that means essentially is that it's based on your ability to pay. So if you have higher level income, you're going to be paying a bit more than someone with lower level income, who's going to end up paying less. And then, of course, you may have any combination of these different financing schemes. The next structural component you want to discuss in your papers is about the level of administration. Is it a federal program? Is it a state program? Or does it reflect a combination of both federal and state administration? You have a program like Social Security, like we mentioned before, that's clearly federal in nature. It's going to be uniformly administered. It doesn't matter where you live, whether you're in Illinois or New York. The employees use the same handbook. You have the same eligibility criteria. You have the same levels of benefits. It's a uniform program throughout the country. That's a federal program. You may have programs that reflect sort of combinations in terms of federal and state administration. So our Medicaid program is an example of both federal and state administration. And in our current era, this is harkening back to your Lindhorst reading about the different Federalist eras, but in this new Federalist era, we have more and more devolution of responsibility to the states. And so you may have some programs that are run just primarily by the states. One type of administration that we make note of here is the block grant system. This is this type of system that characterizes our welfare structure, our TANF structure. This is essentially where the federal government offers a lump sum payment, a lump sum of money to the states to operate the welfare program, but they attach certain conditions to receipt of those funds. That's what we mean by a block grant. And so you have a program, like I mentioned before, like Medicaid. There may be some joint administration where the federal government provides for a certain percentage of funding, but our welfare system is a block grant system. It's not really joint administered. It's going to be devolved. Responsibility is primarily devolved to the state level. And so you'll want to make note of that in your papers for your particular programs or policies. In terms of alternate program characteristics, you'll want to make a distinction between residualist thinking and institutionalist thinking. Residualists would say that social welfare institutions, so taking the big picture first, this is about the role of social welfare in a society, in our society, and when social welfare institutions should come into play. Residualists would say that social welfare institutions only come into play as a last resort, so only when normal structures are broken down, so only when families can't provide for their own, only when private entities can no longer provide for the needs of its citizens, should formal government institutions step in. That's what a residualist would say. And so when you look at our public assistance programs, they certainly reflect residualist thinking. And then you have institutionalist thinking on the other hand, and you see the word institution contained there. And so this is the idea that social welfare institutions serve a normal first-line function, that they're so deeply ingrained that we've come to expect them as a matter of right, in other words. So you can think of things like education, our educational system. Everyone is entitled to free and appropriate public education. We're accustomed to thinking that way. Fire protection, police protection, these are things that we've come to expect as a matter of right. So sociologists will often talk about these institutions that we have in our society. So our social insurance programs often reflect institutionalist thinking. We've come to expect Social Security as a matter of right, I think. You can make that argument. You'll want to say something about selective versus universal principles. Anytime you have a means test, a test of income and or assets, that's going to reflect selective principles. So notice the alignment here. Selective principles will often align with residualist type thinking. Certainly if you're trying to weed out certain people and make sure your resources are being targeted, that's certainly reflective of selective principles, but it's also suggesting residualist thinking in that we only want that program as a last resort. Universal principles, where you have basic categorical criteria that so anyone can become potentially eligible as long as you meet certain categorical criteria. That's what we mean by universal principles. So the alignment here is between universal principles and institutionalist thinking. One caveat here is that some programs may reflect both selective and universal principles. An example that's offered by Dolgoff is with respect to student loans. And so you notice that in the case of student loans that it's selective to the extent that you must meet certain income and asset criteria, but it's also universal in the sense that potentially anyone can benefit from the program And so be careful about programs that reflect both selective and universal principles is the point here. We also make a distinction between public and private programs. Whether it's affiliated with the government or not, that's the basic distinction. Dolgoff makes a further distinction in terms of private programs. There's a distinction between private nonprofit entities and private for-profit entities. The way you can tell here is in terms of their filing status, how they've decided to incorporate how they've decided to file their papers, in other words. So in the case of a private nonprofit entity, they have to file as a 501c3 typically to be of a nonprofit status. And so that's the basic requirement, but you have some agencies, some private agencies that their motive is to make a profit much like any other corporation might. And so that's one distinction. But the larger distinction here is between public entities and private entities. But if you want to go further and make that distinction between private proprietary or for-profit agencies versus private nonprofit entities, you can do so as well. Lastly, you'll want to include a piece about evaluating the program. This is not an exercise in evaluating the program necessarily. We do policy analysis in your second semester course, where we really do policy analysis on a more in-depth level. But here, I just want you to say something about the adequacy of the program along two different dimensions in terms of horizontal adequacy and in terms of vertical adequacy. When we speak of horizontal adequacy, all we're saying there is about the reach of the program. Is the program reaching its intended audience is the concern there. The example here would be, once again, if you're thinking about the Alzheimer's Association, if the intended audience is all persons affected by Alzheimer's disease or dementia in the US, and if it's reaching its intended audience, if there's a sufficient outreach effort, then you may characterize it as horizontally adequate. The fact that they have an 800 number that anyone can call from around the globe, that people from all over, not just the US, but people from Asia or Africa or what have you, can contact that number and get counseling about Alzheimer's-related issues, that would be proof that this program is in fact horizontally adequate. The other dimension is with respect to vertical adequacy, and this is pertaining to the depth or the quality of the program that's offered by the agency. And so once again, to take the example of the Alzheimer's Association, if all that's being offered by the agency is information, basic information and referral, so you call in and they can refer you to some other agency that addresses the issue that you have in mind, but they offer no original services, I think you can characterize that as vertically inadequate. But if the program were to offer, which it does, if it were to offer educational programs, support groups, counseling over the phone even, crisis counseling, maybe a program for people who wander, right, a tracking system for people who wander, that would be evidence of more of a vertical adequacy, right, in the way of the quality and the depth of services that are being provided. And so that's the last dimension that I'd like you to cover in your papers about horizontal and vertical adequacy. We'll stop the lecture here. This covers the first half material. Next week, we'll have a face-to-face review session, so I invite all of you to come to that session next week.